He hadn't touched a rifle since the war, since blood and smoke turned boys into ghosts. But tonight, in the glow of a firelit cabin, the past came roaring back. The woman he'd pulled from hell, Maybelle, was being dragged across the floor, bound and bleeding. The man snarled, $50 just to breathe, sweetheart." Silas stood frozen, not by fear, but by memory, war, death, regret. And then she looked at him, her voice cracked but steady. "I choose you." In that moment, it wasn't just her life on the line. It was his soul. And with trembling hands, he raised the rifle. This isn't just a love story. It's the story of how one broken man chose to fight again, not for country, but for her. Maybelle Quinn wasn't born broken. She was born with fire in her chest and light in her eyes. Born to a mother who sang lullabies made of prairie winds and whispered stories of brave women who carved hope out of hard land. Her childhood was not rich, but it was warm. It was full of soft quilts, worn books, and the scent of cornbread baking in a wood stove. Back then, she believed the world was a place where love could shield you from cold, and kindness always found its way home. But hope is a fragile thing, easily bruised, easily stolen, and in places like Deadrock, Montana, it rarely survives. Deadrock was the kind of town that didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. The sign on the railway station leaned sideways. The church bell hadn't rung in 3 winters. The men drank to forget. The women disappeared, and no one asked where they went. The snow didn't melt. It just got buried deeper each season, just like secrets. Maybelle came to Deadrock not with a suitcase, but in a wagon, half conscious and too sick to protest. After her husband died in a mining collapse, the debt collector said he knew a place where she could earn her keep. She thought he meant a boarding house. He meant a cage. The Dust Lantern Saloon wasn't lit with lanterns. It was lit with red eyes and darker intentions. The floorboards were warped from spilled whiskey, and worse, the air was thick with smoke and despair. And Maudine Blackridge, the madam who ran the place, was colder than the mountain wind. She wore velvet like armor and rings like weapons. Her voice was dipped in bourbon and broken glass. To her, Maybelle was not a grieving widow. She was inventory. One day, Maudine called her sugar with a grin. That night, she backhanded her hard enough to split her lip. In the Dust Lantern, sweetness was just a lie women wore to survive. But Maybelle was fading. The cough had started as a whisper in her throat, then grew sharper, deeper, until blood stained her handkerchief every morning. And still, she was expected to smile. "You're too sick to work," Maudine snapped. "But you better act healthy or you're not worth feeding." So Maybelle worked. She painted her cheeks with rouge to hide the pallor. She tied her corset tighter to keep herself upright. She swallowed water laced with laudanum just to stay conscious. Until the night she couldn't. The wind outside howled like some ancient thing clawing at the walls. Inside, the saloon stank of sweat and old shame. Piano keys clinked off rhythm as a drunk slammed his glass on the counter. Behind the faded velvet curtain, Maybelle sank to her knees, breath shallow, blood rising in her throat. She clutched a stool to keep from falling. No one came. And then Maudine's voice cut through the curtain like a whip. "Get out there, or I'll drag you by your hair." Maybelle tried to stand, and failed. She collapsed, ribs heaving, vision spinning. Somewhere behind her, the men kept drinking. And in that moment, she realized something chilling. She could die right there, on that filthy floor, and no one would care. No one would stop her from disappearing. No one, until someone did. He'd been sitting in the corner since dusk, a tall man wrapped in a black duster, boots caked in snow, and a hat pulled low over his brow. He hadn't touched the whiskey he ordered, just watched the room with the stillness of someone who'd lived through too many storms to flinch at another. The others didn't pay him much attention. Men like him didn't draw noise. They silenced it. Silas Hartley wasn't there for company. He wasn't there for drink. Truth be told, he wasn't sure why he'd come to town at all. Maybe to restock supplies. Maybe to remind himself what loneliness felt like in a room full of people. But when he heard Maudine's voice from behind the curtain, sharp, venomous, something in him shifted. "You lazy little rat! Get out there now, or I swear!" Then the sound of a body hitting the floor. A soft, sickening thud. Silas stood, not abruptly, not to draw attention. Just a slow, silent motion, like a man rising not from habit, but conviction. The saloon didn't notice him at first. The piano kept playing. Laughter echoed from the far table. A man at the bar argued about the price of beef, but by the time he reached the stage, the room had gone quiet. Maudine stood near the curtain, fists clenched, eyes flashing. Behind her, collapsed in a tangle of limbs and torn lace, was Maybelle Quinn. Her lips were pale, her breathing ragged. Blood stained the corner of her mouth. One hand clutched the fabric of the floor, like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to life. "You plan to kill her in front of everyone," Silas said, voice low and clear. Maudine turned. "What did you just say?" He didn't repeat himself. He didn't have to. He looked at Maybelle, then back at the madam. Then from inside his coat, he pulled a wad of bills, folded tight, crisp and clean. He tossed them onto the counter beside the stage. They landed with a soft thump, like a final sentence. "That enough to cover her?" Maudine's jaw tightened. "She's not for sale." "I'm not buying," Silas replied. "I'm taking her." There was something dangerous in his stillness, like a coiled snake that didn't need to hiss to be feared. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. He stepped forward and bent down. Maybelle stirred faintly, eyelids fluttering. Her breath steamed in the cold air, shallow and trembling. He scooped her up as if she weighed nothing, as if she hadn't already carried more than most men twice her size. Her head lolled gently against his shoulder. She didn't speak. She didn't resist. He walked past the tables, past the piano, past the stunned silence. The door creaked open. A blast of frigid wind swept through the saloon, scattering ash and sawdust like a warning. And then they were gone. No one followed. No one dared. Outside, the snow began to fall harder, swallowing their footprints almost as fast as they made them. Silas Hartley rode into the mountains with a woman in his arms and a silence in his chest that hadn't been broken in years. And somewhere deep inside him, a voice whispered, not yet hope, but maybe the beginning of it. This scene isn't just about a man rescuing a woman. It's about something far rarer, someone making the quiet, deliberate choice to do the right thing when no one else would. In most frontier stories, power comes from the barrel of a gun, from who draws fastest, who yells the loudest, who commands the room through violence or fear. But Silas Hartley doesn't raise a weapon. He doesn't bark orders or swing fists. He simply sees a dying woman and decides that her life is worth more than the shame that's been heaped on her. And he acts quietly, intentionally, without asking for praise or payment. That's what makes it powerful. Because in a world like Deadrock, a world that chews people up and spits them out, where mercy is often seen as weakness, this moment is an act of rebellion. It tells us that dignity doesn't have to be earned. It doesn't have to be begged for. It can be given freely. Maybelle Quinn wasn't rescued because she was strong or clever or useful. She was rescued because she was human. And someone finally saw that. And maybe that's the part that matters most. Because in life, many people will walk past the ones who are crumbling. They'll say, "It's not my problem," or "She got herself into this." They'll wait for someone else to care first. But sometimes all it takes is one person who chooses not to keep walking. One person who says, "No, not today, not while I'm here." That kind of courage doesn't make headlines. It doesn't ride in with trumpets. But it's the kind that saves lives. Not just the one being carried out of the fire, but the one doing the carrying too. Because in choosing mercy, Silas doesn't just save Maybelle. He begins the long journey of saving himself. The storm thickened as Silas rode deeper into the hills, snowflakes swirling like ash from some quiet, distant fire. His mare trudged onward through the drifts, each step steady but slow, her breath steaming in the frozen air. He kept one gloved hand on the reins, the other wrapped protectively around the fragile figure pressed against his chest. Maybelle Quinn had barely stirred since they left town. Her head rested against his shoulder, her breath warm but faint against his collarbone. Every so often a tremor ran through her, more from sickness than cold, and each time he drew her closer, adjusting the old wool blanket around her shoulders like armor. When they finally reached the ridge, the cabin stood like a weathered promise in the clearing. Small, solid, smoke-blackened logs, slanted roof, a single crooked window. It wasn't much, but it had stood through worse winters than this one. And maybe, just maybe, it could hold what little life she had left. Silas dismounted carefully and carried her to the door. Inside, the cabin was cold, the hearth long since gone to cinders. He laid her gently on the cot near the window, careful not to jostle her too much. Her skin was clammy, her lips tinged blue, but she was breathing. That had to count for something. He moved with quiet urgency, striking a match, lighting the hearth, feeding it dry kindling from the crate near the wall. Flames flickered to life, hesitant at first, then hungry. He left her boots by the door and wrapped her in a dry quilt from the trunk. She didn't stir. In the corner of the room, he reached for a tin box tucked beside the shelf. Inside were bundles of dried herbs, pine needles, sage, wild chamomile. He brewed them into tea just as his mother once had, when the winters were hard and his brothers came home coughing from the fields. When the kettle whistled, he knelt beside her, lifting her head with care. "Drink," he whispered. "Just a little." She stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, glazed with fever, but she took a sip. The steam curled upward between them. Then she slept again. He sat by the fire, watching her chest rise and fall, his thoughts a tangle of silence. The room, though warmed by flame, still felt cold around the edges, like the ghosts hadn't yet left. He didn't know her story, didn't need to. Her body already spoke it. The bruises, the raw throat, the way she flinched in her sleep. She had lived through something cruel, but so had he. He thought of the war, the boys who never came back, the promises he'd made to himself when it ended. No more killing, no more orders, no more blood on his hands. And yet here he was again, carrying a stranger out of the fire. Not because he was a hero, because he couldn't bear to be a bystander. The fire crackled, the wind howled outside, and somewhere in between the quiet and the pain, he felt something shift. Not hope, not yet, but the first fragile flicker of purpose. She didn't know his name, didn't know the ghost that still clung to him. All she knew was that when no one else reached for her, he did. And for tonight, that was enough. The days that followed were quiet, not the kind of silence that stifles, but the kind that lets things mend. Outside, snow blanketed the world like a shroud, burying sound and memory. The wind rattled the window panes, but inside the cabin, the fire burned steadily, casting golden light that flickered across hand-hewn beams and rough floorboards. Maybelle slept through the first day and most of the second. Her body, starved and bruised, demanded rest more than food. When she woke, her throat was raw, her ribs ached, and she could barely sit up. But she was alive, and for the first time in a long time, no one was yelling at her to perform. Silas brought her tea, broth, and quiet. He spoke little, asked nothing. When he wasn't tending to her, he split wood out back or mended the saddle by the fire. Every movement was precise, practiced, like a man who knew how to survive but wasn't sure how to simply live. Maybelle watched him from the cot, wrapped in thick quilts. She studied the way he moved, deliberate, careful, not out of fear, but habit. He never slammed a door, never raised his voice. When he handed her a cup, he always made sure their fingers didn't brush unless necessary. Respectful, distant, but not unkind. On the third morning, she managed to walk to the hearth, one trembling step at a time. "I'm upright," she said hoarsely, managing a faint smile. He looked up from where he sat near the stove, carving something from a block of wood. "That's a start," he said. No grin, but his voice was gentler than usual. She sat on the floor beside the fire, hugging her knees beneath the blanket. Silence returned, but it felt different now, shared. Later that day, she spotted a photograph above the mantel, a woman in a white dress standing beside a younger Silas. The woman smiled, radiant. Silas, in contrast, looked somber, though his arm was wrapped around her waist. "To your wife?" Maybelle asked. He didn't look up, just nodded once. "I'm sorry." He didn't respond, but the way he set down the carving knife, that said enough. In the evenings, she read aloud from a weathered book she'd found in a drawer, some worn collection of poems, half the pages missing. Her voice was weak, halting, but she read anyway. Silas listened without comment, whittling silently nearby. They shared no plans, no promises, just warmth, just breath, just a strange kind of peace that neither of them had known in years. One night, as the wind screamed against the cabin, Maybelle woke from a nightmare, gasping, trembling, reaching for something that wasn't there. Silas was already beside her. He didn't say anything, just offered his hand. She took it. Their fingers laced slowly, uncertainly. Not lovers, not yet, just survivors. And in the stillness that followed, Maybelle realized something. For the first time in years, she wasn't being watched. She was being seen. And maybe, just maybe, she could start seeing herself again, too. Snow had begun falling again, soft and deceptively gentle. The world outside the cabin looked peaceful, but inside Silas Hartley sensed something wrong, something silent, watching. He noticed the first footprint near the woodpile, then another, too deep, too fresh, and not his. He set the axe down carefully. No sudden moves. The forest, moments ago full of the soft hush of snow on pine, had gone still. No birdsong, no crunch of deer in the distance. The same kind of stillness he'd known during the war. Right before an ambush. He stepped back into the cabin, closing the door behind him with quiet finality. His heart was beating harder than it had in months, and not from fear, but from the return of something he thought he'd buried. "Don't go outside," he said, already loading the shotgun. Maybelle looked up from where she knelt by the fire, stirring the stew. Her eyes blinked with concern. "What is it?" she asked, rising. He shook his head. "Not wolves." She froze. "Then what?" But before he could answer, the door exploded inward. Harlan Deeks stepped into the cabin like he belonged there, tall, broad-shouldered, with snow melting off his coat and a grin that didn't reach his eyes. The rope in his hand was already coiled. His revolver was holstered, unused, for now. "Well," he drawled, looking around, "ain't this cozy?" Maybelle moved back instinctively, her hands shaking, breath catching in her throat. "You've made quite the mess, sweetheart," Deeks said, stepping toward her. $50, just for breathing. Imagine that." Silas raised the shotgun. "Let her go." Deeks turned slowly. "Thought you were just some fool with a savior complex. Guess I was wrong." The two men stared at each other. Years of rage, guilt, and violence hung thick in the air like smoke from a fire that never truly died. Deeks reached for Maybelle. She screamed. Silas didn't move. Couldn't. The rifle weighed 1,000 pounds in his hands. The ghost came fast. The battlefield, the screaming, the boy with blood on his boots, the face of the man Silas shot who never even raised his weapon. His grip trembled. His breath quickened. He was back there, in the war, in the killing, in the horror. "I knew it," Deeks sneered. "You don't have it in you. You're rusted, old man." And then Maybelle turned, bruised, bound, bleeding, but not afraid. Her voice was cracked but steady, eyes burning with something fiercer than fear. "You saved me, Silas. Not because you had to, because you chose to. And now, I choose you." Her words cut through the fog like a blade, and in that moment, everything inside him broke, then reforged. Silas exhaled and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, thunderous in the tight cabin space. Deeks stumbled back, a red bloom spreading across his chest. He looked surprised, almost impressed, before he dropped to his knees and then forward, face first into the snow tracked across the cabin floor. Silence returned, thick and final. Silas dropped the rifle. It hit the ground with a thud. His legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees beside it, gasping, sweat beating down his brow despite the cold. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. His body trembled as the past surged forward like a wave. The battlefield, the cries, the smell of burning flesh, the boy who never blinked again. Then, warmth, not fire. Maybelle crawling to him, still bound, her forehead pressing to his. "It's over," she whispered. "He's gone. You saved me." But Silas didn't answer. He couldn't yet see that this wasn't just a killing. It was a release, not just for her, but for him. The cabin was still. The wind howled through the broken door, then settled into a hum. The fire flickered gently. Later, he would fix the door, sweep the floor, stitch her wounds, sleep without waking in sweat. But for now, they sat in silence. Two people too worn to speak, too shaken to move, but breathing, together. For the first time in a long time, he had pulled a trigger not out of hate or command, but for something worth protecting, for someone who chose him back. And in the quiet, something changed. Not peace, but the beginning of it. Spring didn't come all at once. It arrived in slow breaths, in the drip of melted snow from the eaves, in the muddy footprints tracked in from thawing trails, in the faint scent of pine returning to the breeze. But it came, and with it, something else returned to the cabin on the ridge. Life. Silas repaired the door first, not because it was broken, but because it symbolized something. The old one had splintered beneath violence. The new one was sturdy, hand-fitted and quiet when it shut. Maybelle watched him work from the steps, a shawl around her shoulders, a mug of tea warming her hands. Her bruises had faded to yellow ghosts beneath her skin. Her cough had become infrequent. Her voice, once brittle and soft, had begun to stretch again, like a bird relearning its song. Each morning she opened the windows. She said she liked the smell of the earth when it was wet with memory. That's how she described it, wet with memory. She planted wildflowers along the path leading up to the cabin, sage, white daisies, and one stubborn golden bloom that no one knew the name of. "I don't care," she said with a smile. "It reminds me of warmth." Silas didn't speak much, but he listened better than most men she'd known. And when she laughed, which she did now, more often than she expected, he always paused. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because it was enough just to hear it. They lived in rhythms. He chopped wood, she stirred stew. He fixed a fence, she mended old curtains. Neither owed the other anything, yet they moved through each day as if they shared one quiet heartbeat. Some nights, Silas still woke gasping, drenched in sweat, but he no longer suffered alone. Maybelle would take his hand, press her forehead to his chest, and breathe with him until the shaking stopped. One morning she found him by the fire, not carving bullets, but a ring. It was rough, imperfect, shaped from a melted coin, but it shone like it had purpose. He didn't get down on one knee, didn't make a speech. He just walked over, placed it in her palm, and said, "If you want to stay, I'd like to build something that doesn't break." She didn't say yes. She didn't have to. Her tears said everything. They were married beneath a pine tree not far from the cabin. No priest, no witnesses, just two birds calling from the treetops and a breeze warm enough to believe in. She wore a blue dress. He wore the same coat he'd first rescued her in, and the ring, flawed and glowing, fit perfectly. That night, sitting on the porch, wrapped in the same blanket that had once kept her alive on horseback, Maybelle rested her head on his shoulder. "You never ask me what I want," she said. He looked down, one brow slightly raised. "I want this," she whispered. "Not because I owe you, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because this is the first time I've ever felt like I wasn't just surviving." Silas didn't answer. Instead, he turned slightly and placed her hand against his chest. "You feel that?" she asked. He nodded. "It still beats," she said. "After everything. After war. After pain. After ghosts. It still beats. And now it beats for me." And in his silence, she heard it again. That steady, slow, tender rhythm that had once been buried beneath ash and guilt. A few weeks later, Maybelle sat at the table with a piece of parchment and a borrowed pencil. She wrote a letter, not to Silas, not to anyone, but to the girl she used to be. "You thought no one would ever see you again without shame. You thought your body was broken and your heart unworthy. You were wrong, because a man saw you, not for what you'd lost, but for what you still carried. He gave you warmth when you were freezing, food when you were starving, and a name that meant safe. Some hearts don't come whole. Some arrive chipped, scarred, scared. But the hands that hold them, those are what matter." In a world that often confuses noise for meaning, this story reminds us of something quieter, but more lasting. That healing rarely happens in grand gestures. It happens in silence, in staying, in listening when there's nothing left to say. Silas Hartley wasn't a hero out of legend. He was a man carrying more grief than hope, more silence than song. But when the moment came, he didn't run. He didn't reach for glory. He simply stepped forward, quietly like someone who knew that dignity is a door you open for others. Maybelle didn't need a savior. She needed someone who believed her worth hadn't been erased by what she'd endured, that her softness was not weakness, that her story wasn't over. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us. Not everyone wears their pain out loud. Not every battle looks like one. But when we choose to reach out, to stay, to forgive, to believe in one another anyway, that's where true courage lives. If this story stirred something in you, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us about your quiet heroes or your second chances. We'd be honored to listen. And if you believe stories like this matter, stories of quiet bravery and redemptive love, subscribe, like, and come back next week. Because around here, we don't just tell tales of the West. We tell emotional stories that remind us of who we are and who we still might become.